The library at Ashford Park held its breath in the hour before sunrise. Eleanor Voss had learned, over 12 years in that house, that the room was different in the dark. The tall shelves pressed closer. The smell of leather and old paper grew particular and dense. And the portrait above the chimney-piece seemed to watch with an attention it withheld during daylight. She had spent the better part of the last fortnight in that room. She had 9 days left to be in it. The rosewood writing case sat open at the corner of the reading table, its brass fittings catching the low candlelight. Eleanor had brought it down from the late Duchess's sitting room herself, when it became clear that no one else would think to settle what remained of the household accounts. 3 footmen had already been dismissed by Lord Peveril Crane. The kitchen accounts were paid through the end of October. The apothecary's bill for Mrs. Hartwell's November remedies had not been. Eleanor was addressing that now in her own careful hand. From her own depleted funds, because it seemed to her the only honest thing to do. The room was cold. The fire had gone low. She did not notice either. She did not hear the door until it had already opened. The man who entered was not Peveril Crane. He was taller, and he moved without the particular quality of ownership that Crane carried, that practiced ease of a man assessing what he was owed. This man moved like someone who had been elsewhere for a long time and was not entirely certain the ground would hold. He stopped when he saw her. He was still dusty from travel. His cravat had been loosened at some point in the night and not retied. He was, Eleanor understood with a cold startlement, the Duke of Ashford. She rose. She had never met him. The Duchess had kept a small miniature of him on her writing table and spoken of him with the particular economy she applied to things that mattered most to her, briefly, exactly, without ornament. He was 33. He had sold his commission 6 months ago. He had not been to Ashford Park in 4 years. In the candlelight, he looked as though he had not slept in 2 of them. "Miss Voss," he said. His voice was low, neither warm nor cold. He seemed to have known who she was. She did not ask how. She said, "Your Grace, I beg your pardon for the hour. I did not know you were expected." "I was not," he said. He looked at the rosewood case. He looked at the candle. He looked, finally, at her, with an expression she could not read. Not unkindness, but something that had not yet decided what it was. "You should not be awake. I'm settling the accounts," she said. A pause. He said, "Come away from the cold window. Sit down." It was not a request. It was not unkind. Eleanor sat, because she was tired, and because there was something in the order itself that felt, strangely, like the first solid thing she had touched since the will reading. She was aware, sitting, that her hands had gone quiet in her lap. She did not understand why. She had not known Henry Montrose, Duke of Ashford, for 6 minutes, and already something in her had stopped bracing. The story of how Eleanor Voss came to be sitting in the library of Ashford Park at dawn, with 9 days left to her tenancy of it, was not a long one, though it had the particular quality of weight that short stories sometimes carry when every word in them was lived. Her father, the Reverend Arthur Voss, had served the parish nearest Ashford Park for 11 years before his death of a fever in the autumn of 1807, when Eleanor was 12 years old. He had been, by all accounts, a man of considerable learning and no fortune whatsoever, and the 2 things had given him an acquaintance with the Duchess of Ashford that his station would not otherwise have produced. She had borrowed books from him. He had borrowed her greenhouse in the winters when his own study grew too cold for reading. They had met across the stone wall between the churchyard and the park's south grounds on enough mornings to have developed the particular respect of 2 people, who have noticed that the other is paying careful attention to the same world. When the Reverend Voss died, he left Eleanor a small trunk of books, a name that was respectable, but not useful, and no provision for her future. The Duchess had taken her in without ceremony or particular display of feeling. She had said, at the time, that it was the sensible thing to do, and Eleanor had understood early that the Duchess expressed care in the language of practicality. She had been educated at Ashford Park, given a small set of rooms near the Duchess's own, and put to work, as companion, as reader, as the person who managed the things the Duchess found tedious, with the brisk mutual understanding that both parties were better off for the arrangement. It was not a warm arrangement in any obvious sense. The Duchess was not given to obvious warmth. She praised indirectly and corrected with precision. And once, when Eleanor was 15 and had done something that prevented a significant embarrassment to the household, had pressed Eleanor's hand for a single moment without saying anything at all. Eleanor had understood from that single moment more than most people communicated in a year. She had believed these 12 years that the Duchess loved her in the way the Duchess loved things. Quietly, consistently, without much demonstration, and without doubt. The will reading had corrected that understanding. The will, as read by Mr. Simmons, the solicitor, on the morning of the 4th of November, 1818, left the estate's contents and all movable property to Lord Peveril Crane, the Duchess's nephew, by blood. It made no provision for Eleanor. It instructed that the house be made available to Crane and his family at the earliest practicable date, and that all current household members not in Crane's employ be given a fortnight's notice and reasonable travel assistance. Eleanor had not wept. She had sat very still and thought of the Duchess's face in the last weeks of her illness, the thin hands, the careful speech, the way her eyes had rested on Eleanor with an expression she had not been able to name at the time. She could name it now. She had been wrong about what it meant. Peveril Crane arrived with his wife the following morning, before the Duchess's rooms had been properly aired. He was a broad-shouldered man of 40, with the confidence of someone whose positions had never been seriously contested, and he moved through Ashford Park with the specific authority of inheritance, touching things, measuring distances, pausing to examine the portrait arrangements with a proprietary tilt of his head. He spoke to Eleanor once, on that first afternoon, to confirm the date of her departure. That evening, through the half-open door of the yellow sitting-room, she heard him say to Lady Dorothea Crane, with the casual ease of a man speaking of weather, "The Duchess's little project is leaving on the 14th. We shall be comfortable enough after that." Lady Dorothea's murmur of assent was soft and certain as snow. Eleanor had closed the door of her own room that night and sat for a very long time beside a fire she did not feel, turning over 12 years of a life, and looking for the places where she had been wrong. Henry Montrose had sent no word ahead of his arrival. He had not, apparently, been in England when the Duchess died. There had been some business in Edinburgh that extended past its expected close. The first letter from Simmons had reached him only on the 30th of October. He had come directly south from there, stopping one night at an inn and arriving at Ashford Park at 4 in the morning with no footman and a single bag, having dismissed his coachman at the stable yard with unusual brevity. Eleanor learned this from Mrs. Hartwell, who appeared at the library door at 7:30 with tea, and the specific expression she wore when she had information she was weighing carefully. "He asked for you," Mrs. Hartwell said. "At breakfast. He asked which rooms you occupied, and whether you had been given proper notice or simply turned out. I told him the fortnight, and he said nothing else for some minutes." Eleanor poured the tea. "He is the Duke," she said. "It is his estate." "He is," Mrs. Hartwell agreed, in a tone that was not agreement at all. That morning was the first time Henry sought her out deliberately. He came to the library at 10, ostensibly to examine the catalog she had been maintaining for the Duchess's collection, and he stood for a long time reading the entries in her careful hand, without speaking. The room felt different with him in it, not smaller, but more specific, as if the books and the shelves and the cold gray light through the tall windows had all sharpened their edges slightly. He asked about the organization. He asked about the gap she had noted in the ecclesiastical volumes. He asked with the care of a man who knows when a question serves two purposes. Whether she had noticed any correspondence filed among the books, rather than the writing table. She had not. She told him so. He looked at her then with the same expression from the night before. The thing that had not yet decided what it was. She thought, briefly and without intention, that his eyes were an unusual shade, not gray, not quite blue, the color of river water in November. "Finish the catalog," he said. "All of it. Do not leave on the 14th. "My lord," she said, "Lord Crane has given me notice." "I have given you a countermand," he said. "The house is mine." The notice was premature. He paused, and she had the distinct sense that he was choosing his words with the same care a man uses when disarming something. "I need the catalog finished. Stay until it is done." She did not say yes. She did not say no. She turned back to the entries, and she was aware of him standing there for another full minute before he left. And she was aware of the warmth that had nothing to do with the fire, moving along the inside of her wrist. She told herself it was relief. She did not entirely believe it. If you have ever sat with a story you did not yet understand and felt the shape of it before the words arrived, you will know what the next days were like for Eleanor. Stay with this a little longer. The village of Ashford Cross lay a mile from the park along a road that was passable in autumn if you chose your footing. Eleanor had walked it twice a week since the Duchess's decline, when she had taken over the small parish visits the Duchess could no longer make herself. She went the following Tuesday with a basket of preserves and a note of inquiry for the miller's wife, who had been ill, and it was on her return, cutting through the high street to avoid the muddy lane, that she stopped at the apothecary's doorway. Inside she could hear raised voices. One of them was thin and frightened. Meg, who had been the Duchess's chambermaid for 7 years and had been among the first to be dismissed by the Crane household, had contracted a respiratory fever. The apothecary, a cautious man named Mr. Dawes, had prepared a course of treatment. But Meg had no money since her dismissal and no family in the county, and Mr. Dawes was in the process of explaining this to her at some volume. Eleanor went in. She paid the account herself, in the specific tone that closed discussion, and she arranged with Mr. Dawes that Meg be allowed to collect the subsequent remedies on credit against Eleanor's name for the duration of recovery. This took 4 minutes. She was back on the high street before Meg had properly finished crying. She did not see Henry Montrose until she turned from the apothecary's door. He was standing across the narrow street in the shadow of the saddler's awning. He was perfectly still. He had been there long enough to have witnessed the entirety of it through the apothecary's glass window, and he made no attempt, when her eyes found him, to pretend otherwise. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. It was direct and contained, the way a held coal looks before the heat reaches the surface. He crossed the street. He did not speak. He took the basket from her arm without asking, and they walked back to the park in silence, and the silence was not empty. She was aware of him beside her as a specific weight and warmth, a thing that had been absent from the world for some time and had returned without announcement. Her pulse was not entirely steady. She did not look at him. At the park's gate, he said, "You paid that yourself?" "Yes," she said. He said nothing else. He handed back the basket. He held the gate. She thought, walking up the gravel toward the house, that she could hear him standing at the gate behind her for a long time before he followed. The days that followed had a quality Eleanor could not quite name. Henry appeared in the library each evening under the pretext of the estate survey she had been asked to cross-reference. He sat across from her at the reading table and asked questions about the Duchess's correspondence habits, the organization of the household records, the names of the witnesses on various old documents. The questions had the feel of questions that wanted answers. And also, underneath that, the feel of questions that wanted to remain in the same room as her answers. She noticed this and said nothing about it. She noticed the way he held himself at a measured distance from anything he might want. She noticed that when she reached across the table to hand him a document, he did not move back, and that he was careful, always, not to take more than the document. She noticed the warmth in her own chest and told herself it was the fire. It was 5 days after the village that Eleanor found the letter. She had not been looking for it. She had been searching the Duchess's writing table for the record of a disputed land survey, and she had opened the lower drawer to find a sheaf of correspondence rubber-banded together. The top letter was addressed to Henry, in his father's hand, and it had never been sent. She recognized the handwriting because she had seen it in the estate ledgers. The elder Duke had kept the accounts himself. She should have replaced it immediately. She had read 2 lines before she understood what it was. She had read 6 lines before she could stop. The letter was dated 3 weeks before the elder Duke's death. It was not a gentle letter. It catalogued in the careful hand of a man who had thought long and carefully about what he wanted to say the elder Duke's belief that his son had chosen the army over his family out of a desire to escape the weight of expectation, and that this choice had constituted a form of abandonment. He had not been unkind. He had been precise, which was worse. At the bottom of the letter, in a different pen, written in a shakier hand that suggested illness, was a single additional line, written in that shakier hand. "I do not believe I sent this," it read. "I hope I did not. I am not certain I was right." Eleanor replaced the letter. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the writing table, breathing. When Henry came to the library that evening and found her at the catalogue, she looked at his face and saw, suddenly, things she had not had the vocabulary for before. The quality of stillness. The way he held a room at a slight distance, as if he had not quite given himself permission to belong to it. The care he took not to ask for anything that could be refused. He sat across from her at the reading table. He was ostensibly reviewing the estate survey she had set out. She said, carefully, "Your father's writing table has correspondence that has not been sorted. You should see it, before the Cranes have access." He looked up. "I did not read it," she said. A pause so long she counted it. "I know you did," he said. His voice was level, not accusing. Something quieter than that, relieved, almost, the way a man sounds when a thing he had been carrying in silence is finally named, even incompletely. She did not deny it. She said, "He was wrong." Henry was quiet for a very long time. In the hearth, the fire shifted. Outside, it was beginning to rain. "He was not entirely wrong," Henry said finally. It was the most interior sentence he had spoken in her presence, and she understood that it cost him something to say it, and that he had said it because she had not looked away. She wanted to say a great many things. She said none of them. She kept her eyes on the survey map in front of her. She was aware of his hands on the table across from her, and the rain on the windows, and the particular quality of warmth in that specific room in that specific hour. And she thought that something had shifted between them, not broken open, not declared, but quietly and permanently moved, the way a door moves when someone leans against it without turning the handle. That was when she felt it clearly for the first time. The wanting, without the management she had applied to it. The way she had begun, without deciding to listen for his step in the corridor. The way the library had changed in character from the room she worked in to the room where something was quietly becoming possible. She did not permit herself to name it, but she did not, either, tell it to stop. It was the day before the dinner that the third-party report reached Eleanor. James, the youngest of the remaining footmen, came to the library at noon with a look of careful embarrassment on his face. He had overheard something, he said, in the entrance hall. Lord Crane had been speaking with his secretary about the proposed letting of 2 of the estate's tenant farms, and in the course of this had made reference to certain complications of tenure. The complications, as Crane had apparently put it, would resolve themselves entirely once the Duchess's little project had been removed from the premises, which would happen with or without the catalogue's completion. Eleanor thanked James. She kept her voice level. She told him she would have the North Wing inventory finished by Thursday, regardless. When he left, she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the reading table, looking at the rosewood writing case. She had, she understood, been a fool for the entirety of the last week. Not about the catalogue. About the warmth she had allowed herself to feel at the reading table each evening. About the basket and the gate and the November light on the lane. About all of it. A woman of no particular position. In a house she was being asked to leave. Permitting herself to feel warm toward a man who had said nothing, while her name was spoken with such casual dismissal in his presence. She was her father's daughter. She would finish the catalogue. She would leave on the 14th with her account settled and her head level. And she would not revisit, in the long years after, the 11 days she had spent being foolish. The dinner at Ashford Park on the night of the 14th of November was Peveril Crane's occasion, and he had organized it with the specific confidence of a man demonstrating possession. 12 guests. The county's principal families. A table set with the Duchess's silver, which Crane had spent the preceding week inventorying with Lady Dorothea, and a leather notebook. Henry had been invited, it was his house, and he had accepted without much expression. Eleanor had not been invited, which was technically correct, given that she was neither guest nor family, but she had been asked by Mrs. Hartwell to supervise the kitchen preparation, and this placed her in a particular position, present in the house, visible in the corridors, and not quite absent enough to be irrelevant. She had understood by the 3rd day of that week what the dinner was for. It was not for the county families. It was the occasion on which Peveril Crane intended to make his occupation of Ashford Park irrevocable in the eyes of everyone who mattered in the neighborhood. Henry had not objected to the plan. Eleanor had begun to understand, by the end of that week, that Henry's silence was not indifference. She did not know what it was instead. She had not permitted herself to make assumptions. She was a woman of no particular position, and the season had been deciding the worth of such women for longer than she had been alive. She was in the corridor outside the dining room when she heard Lord Crane's voice through the half-open door, pitched for the table. He was in the middle of an anecdote about the Duchess's later years, affectionate in tone, proprietary in framing. Then, at its close, he said, "Of course, my aunt was always fond of her little projects. There was a ward she had taken in, a clergyman's daughter. Very well-intentioned, I am sure, and these arrangements can be very sweet. One does hope she is settling into her new circumstances." He paused. The particular pause of a man who knows he has an audience. She was always the Duchess's little project, and nothing more. The world cannot provide for sentiment. The table's murmur was not unkind. It was worse than unkind. It was agreeable. Eleanor stood in the corridor and did not move. At the foot of the table, she knew Henry was present. She had heard him arrive, heard his chair, heard the measured low register of his voice in the earlier conversation. She waited in the corridor for something. Nothing came. She went back to the kitchen. She thanked Mrs. Partridge for the evening's work. She went upstairs and sat on her bed in the dark and thought with great clarity that she had been foolish, that the 12 years in this house, the catalogue, the accounts, the ward who had never been family, all of it had been exactly what Crane said, and she had refused to see it. The Duchess had not loved her enough to protect her from this. And Henry, whatever the warmth in that library had been, whatever the weight of his hand at the gate, was not going to cross a dining room for a woman of no particular position. She had known this. She had not quite believed it. She believed it now. She had been sitting at her writing table for 20 minutes, the lamp low, a letter to a widowed cousin in Bath half begun before her, when she heard the knock at her door. She did not answer. The knock came again. Then Mrs. Hartwell's voice, low and urgent. "Miss Voss, you must come down. Now. Bring nothing. Just come." Eleanor did not know what had changed in the 40 minutes since she had left the corridor. She would learn it later, in pieces. Henry had left the table immediately after Crane's speech, she was told, with the quiet directness of a man who has finished deciding something. He had found Mrs. Hartwell in the passage. He had asked her directly whether the Duchess had said anything in her final weeks about her intentions for the estate, and Mrs. Hartwell, who had been waiting for 12 days for someone to ask exactly that question, had taken him to the library. She had shown him the rosewood writing case. The hidden drawer was a thing the Duchess had built herself 30 years ago with the help of the estate's carpenter. For reasons she had never explained to anyone except, as it turned out, the one person she trusted to stand at that desk after her. Mrs. Hartwell had known about it, because she had known about most things. Inside the drawer was a single document, a will in the Duchess's own hand, witnessed by Mrs. Hartwell and by the undergardener James Webb, dated the 15th of October, 1818. In it, she left Eleanor the dower house and an income of £400 per year. It was not the will that had been read at the inquest. Mr. Simmons, who had been among the dinner guests and was a thorough man, had examined it in the library by candlelight for 11 minutes, asked 4 questions of Mrs. Hartwell, compared the handwriting to 3 other documents in the Duchess's hand, and said, with the particular quiet of a man whose professional certainty is rarely shaken, and is currently being put to the test, that he believed it authentic. Eleanor came downstairs into the entrance hall to find the dining room's doors standing open and the table sitting in a silence she felt across the threshold before she crossed it. The county families were arranged in their chairs with the careful stillness of people who have understood that something significant is occurring and have made the private decision to witness it. Peveril Crane was on his feet. His face was a controlled version of the expression it would later be in private. Lady Dorothea had set down her fork and was looking at the table's surface with the precise attention of a woman cataloguing exits. Mr. Simmons stood beside Henry at the head of the table. He was holding a document. Henry was at the head of the table, which was not where Crane had seated him. He had moved. Crane said, with the last coherent confidence left to him, "My Lord Duke, this is irregular. These proceedings should be handled in proper form, with full examination of the relevant instruments before any public announcement is made." "They will be," Henry said. He was very calm. The calm was not indifference. It was the specific stillness of a man who has made a decision and has stopped counting the cost of it. "Mr. Simmons has examined the document. He will file his formal attestation in the morning. Tonight, There is one thing that wants saying in front of those who were present for Lord Crane's remarks. Eleanor was standing in the doorway. She had not realized the dining room's occupants had begun to register her presence at the edges of their attention until Henry looked at her. He looked at her in the way he had looked at her in the apothecary's window. Then he said, into the held breath of that room, without raising his voice, "Miss Voss is to be addressed as my intended wife." 12 words, delivered level, as a statement of existing fact. He did not look away from her while he said them. The silence that followed had a texture she would carry with her for the rest of her life. It was not triumphant. It was the specific silence of a thing finally made true in the presence of witnesses. It was the silence of a room deciding all at once that it had been wrong about the shape of things. Crane said something. She did not hear it. Lady Dorothea made a sound that might have been a word. Mrs. Simmons, at the far end of the table, pressed a hand to her mouth. The alderman's wife from the third house along the lane turned to her husband with the particular expression of a woman updating her understanding of a story she thought she already knew. Henry crossed the room to where Eleanor stood in the doorway. He stopped before her. She looked up at his face and found it open in a way it had not been in the library, at the gate, in the village street, in any of the days she had known him. Whatever he had kept behind that careful distance, he had let go of it. "You did not know," he said quietly. Too quietly for the table, though the table was watching everything. "No," she said. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. "I did not ask your permission," he said. "And I would like to, now, properly, if you will allow it." She thought of 12 years in this house. She thought of the Duchess's face in its last weeks, watchful and precise. She understood, standing there in that doorway with the candlelight behind her, the thing she had been unable to name in those final weeks. The Duchess had not switched the will to abandon her. She had written the second will, the real one, the night before she died, in the full knowledge that the first would be found and contested, and she had hidden it in the rosewood case that Eleanor alone would use, because she had trusted Eleanor to be in that library. She had trusted Henry to come home. She had known, the Duchess, that Eleanor and Henry were both people who needed to be placed in the same room and then left alone in it. What the Duchess had written, by the mechanism of the hidden drawer and the witnessed will and the rosewood case left on the reading table, was not a testament at all. It was a letter. It was the long, exact, practically expressed declaration that the Duchess had never managed to say aloud in 12 years of pressed hands and borrowed greenhouse winters and the particular economy of a woman who expressed love by making provision. "I trust you," the hidden drawer said. "I always did." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I will allow it." He offered his hand, gloved, palm upward, in the old formal way. She placed hers in it. His fingers closed. She felt the warmth of it through both their gloves, steady and unhurried, a thing that intended to continue. Behind them, the table began to breathe again. She was aware of Mrs. Hartwell in the corridor. She was aware, dimly, of Crane's voice beginning a procedural argument that Mr. Simmons was already quietly shutting down. She was aware of the cold air from the entrance hall behind her, and the warm, candle-lit room in front of her, and the particular quality of Henry's hand around hers. And she thought that she had spent 12 years in this house learning to occupy the precise amount of space she was permitted. She thought that she was going to need a different method. The dower house at the edge of Ashford Park South grounds was smaller than the park itself by a considerable margin. And it was perfect. It had 6 rooms, a kitchen garden that had been let go a little and could be recovered, a south-facing window in the sitting room that caught the light from 9 in the morning until the light went, and a fireplace in the main room that drew well. It had stood empty for 6 years since the last dowager, and it had about it the specific quality of a room that has been waiting without knowing it was waiting. Eleanor moved her things in over 2 days in late November. Mrs. Hartwell came to help and stayed to drink tea and sit in the south window and look out at the frost with an expression of settled satisfaction. She would have liked this, Mrs. Hartwell said, not specifying who, because she did not need to. I believe she planned it, Eleanor said. She planned most things, Mrs. Hartwell said, and pressed Eleanor's hand once, briefly, without further comment. The Duchess's original will had been formally entered into record by Mr. Simmons on the morning after the dinner. Peveril Crane's solicitor raised 3 procedural objections in the following fortnight. Henry's solicitor answered each one without apparent difficulty. The third objection was withdrawn on the 21st of November. Crane and his wife left Ashford Park on the 22nd with 3 carriages and the specific dignity of people who have decided to characterize events differently in the telling. Eleanor did not watch them go. She was in the library, finishing the catalogue. Henry came to the Dower House most mornings now. He had a habit of arriving before she had entirely finished her correspondence and standing in the sitting-room doorway with his coat on, as if he did not wish to presume. She had, over the weeks, begun leaving the door open. He had, over the weeks, begun coming inside without waiting to be invited, and this small shift in the arrangement seemed to both of them more significant than it had any reasonable right to be. He brought things. A book from his father's library that he thought she had not read. A survey of the Dower House grounds he had commissioned without telling her. Once, inexplicably, a jar of honey from a tenant farm 3 miles east, which he set on her table and made no reference to, and which she thanked him for and also made no reference to, and which sat on the table between them for an entire morning while they worked, and somehow constituted the most intimate conversation they had yet had. He stayed later each time. He found reasons. On a morning in mid-December, with the frost still on the lawn and the winter sun beginning its shallow arc above the south grounds, Eleanor stood at the window with the rosewood writing case on the seat beside her. She had brought it from the library when she moved her things. Mrs. Hartwell had told her to keep it, and she had not argued. She heard the door. She did not turn. Henry came to stand beside her at the window. He was holding a letter. He set it on the window seat beside the case and stood for a moment, looking out at the frost. "My father's solicitor," he said. "There was a codicil I did not know about. He left me his library." She turned from the window. She looked at his profile, the jaw, the set of his mouth, the quality of stillness that she had learned to read now as a man who had been alone inside himself for a long time, and was no longer entirely certain he wished to remain so. She thought of the unsent letter in the lower drawer. She thought of the single added line, written in illness, uncertain even of itself. "That is something," she said. "It is," he said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've been thinking about what you said, that he was wrong." She waited. "I'm beginning to believe you were right," he said. He said it without looking at her. The way he said the things that cost him. Carefully. Without fanfare. Without asking to be praised for the saying. "I am not certain I have been in any particular room with anyone's permission until now." The frost on the lawn was melting in patches, the winter sun working at it slowly. Eleanor picked up the rosewood writing case and turned it in her hands. The hidden drawer, sprung open weeks ago, sat in its small square space, empty and honest now. The secret kept and the secret released, both in the same small piece of wood. She thought of the Duchess's hands on it, the night before the end. What it must have cost, to trust so completely in the people she had chosen, and to say nothing about it except through the mechanism of the case itself. To have loved, all along, in exactly the language of provision she had always used, and to have trusted that Eleanor, who had spent 12 years learning to read her, would eventually understand. Eleanor set the case back on the window seat. She looked at Henry, all of him, plainly, without the careful management she had learned to apply to her own wanting. He turned from the window and looked at her. "I think," she said, "you have been in this room for some time already." Something crossed his face that she would later attempt to describe and find she could not, because it was not any single thing. It was not relief, exactly. It was not joy, precisely. It was closer to what a man's face does when he has been standing outside in the cold for longer than he realized, and finally comes through the door and finds the fire already lit, and someone waiting at the table who had expected him all along. He crossed the room. He stopped before her with the same formality as the dining room, the same offered hand, the same quality of intention. The careful distance had gone out of him, and what remained was only the warmth and the steadiness and the choice, made plainly, without qualification, and without any pretense that it was a practical arrangement. She put her hand in his. Outside the south-facing window, the frost had finished melting. The winter sun lay across the lawn of Ashford Park in its long, oblique way, and the rosewood writing case sat on the window seat in the light, its empty drawer open, the Duchess's trust finally and completely given, and finally and completely received. The dower house was quiet. The fire was going. Outside, the last of the frost dissolved into the cold December grass, and the day continued in its slow, ordinary way. And both of them were present for it. And the day was entirely and without qualification theirs. Thank you for staying with Eleanor to the end of her story. If something here moved you, leave a word below, and I will know you were listening.